The thing about all of these attackers are they're not outwardly evil people. In other words, they're very effective propagandists. There's a lot of naivete about communism in general. And it's only if China were to get into a real conflict. In the case of Taiwan, if that paradigm is true, they should be arming themselves to the teeth right now. And we've got to give people the confidence they can resist that.
朋友们好，欢迎来到辛恬面对面。俗话说呢，学习历史才能避免历史重演。这正是斯坦福大学胡佛研究所资深研究员维克多·汉森教授最近出的一本书的目的。这本书名呢就叫《一切的终结：战争如何走向毁灭 The End of Everything: How Wars Descend into Annihilation》。作为一名身负名望的军事历史学家和曾经在美国海军学院任教的学者，汉森教授呢检视分析了历史上4个文明社会是如何消亡的，毁灭性的战争是如何终结了那个时代的政治制度和文化。那么通过这本书这样的一个分析呢，他是想要警示即便是在我们这个时代，类似的事情呢都可能发生。其实这个采访是我在汉森教授几个月之前发表新书的时候做的，后来呢因为多种原因就没有能够有时间制作出来。不过呢，我觉得现在还恰好是一个很好的时机跟大家来分享。为什么呢？我们看到当选总统川普呢是紧锣密鼓的提名他的外交和国家安全官员，组建了一个强硬的对华鹰派的团队。那我们就知道呢，他是明白美国和自由世界所面对的最大的威胁是什么，但是呢，到底应该要怎么做呢？虽然说汉森教授在发表他这本书的时候一切还没有像现在这样明朗但是呢，他所描述的历史事实和分析的现实情况呢，其实是非常及时、非常重要的一些信息，而且呢，跟我们华人是密切相关的。那喜欢汉森教授的朋友我相信您会再一次的为他渊博的历史学识和深度的分析而震撼。总共大概是1个小时左右的采访。那么这期节目呢，辛恬先会跟您分享上半部分，下半部分会在下周发布。所以呢，请您要记得确认一下您是有订阅辛恬面对面频道的，并且呢打开小铃铛。干净世界的朋友注册一个账号，点击关注，这样就不会错过下一集新的视频了。另外呢，有朋友建议我在采访节目里面呢，每次都可以教一个英文词，可以借着学习英文，不知道大家觉得怎么样呢？那我会在这次节目的最后尝试一次也请朋友们给我反馈，好不好？好的，那历史上呢，其实有多个灾难性的战争毁灭了文明。那汉森教授在这本书中选了4个这样的战争。我好奇的第一个问题就是汉森教授为什么选择了那4个呢？
Well, usually when war takes place, the losers are not annihilated. Even in World War II, the Germans and the Japanese were given unconditional terms, but the Allies allowed them to recalibrate with new governments. And even Attila the Hun and Tamerlane and the monsters of history, Genghis Khan, when they swept through and killed people, they didn't systematically try to dismantle the language, the religion, the culture. But every once in a while that happens, and there's 8 or 9 or 10 examples that are notable, but I picked 4 that I thought might be the most instructive. The destruction of Alexander the Great, the destruction of ancient Thebes, a city-state where Oedipus and Antigone, those myths take place, was utterly destroyed by Alexander the Great. And then Carthage in the Third Punic War was leveled by Scipio Aemilianus. In 1453, Constantinople was completely destroyed. Some of the buildings were left for the Muslims, but the Ottoman Turks under Mehmet II destroyed it, and the culture, the religion, the language. And the same thing was true of the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan. Hernan Cortez leveled it. He destroyed the religion, and within 30 years, there were nobody who really identified as Aztecs. And so I was wondering how this happened, how it could be possible. And then at the epilogue, I had a paradigm or a template that showed that these things had reoccurring commonalities, that the targeted people were very naive. They had visions of past grandeur. They'd all had been renowned cities and empires. Carthage had been there for 800 years. Constantinople, 1,100 years under the Byzantines. Thebes, 1,200 years. So they thought they were invulnerable. They had enormous fortifications and defenses. They thought they would be indomitable. Nobody could take them. They had no idea of the nature of the people who were attacking them. They didn't understand who Alexander the Great was, his capabilities or his intent, or Scipio Aemilianus was, or the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, Mehmet, or they had no idea who Hernan Cortez was. And out of that paradigm, in the epilogue, I looked at places in the world where countries or nations or languages or civilizations are being threatened by large powers, and they are capable of being wiped out, and these large powers are capable of doing it. And we today discount it and say it would never happen here. But history suggests that it could happen here, especially in the age of bioweapons, nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, and artificial intelligence. And, as a footnote, in the epilogue, I go around the globe and show the vulnerability of the Greeks, the Kurds, the Armenians, the Taiwanese, the Ukrainians, and Israel, and all the threats that have been leveled. And so when I went to Taiwan, I mentioned some of the threats that people in China, of the People's Liberation Army and the Communist Chinese Communist Party, have leveled, threatening to nuke Taiwan or nuke Japan or wipe them out, or they have said that Taiwan is an aberrant civilization. It doesn't really exist, and they want to absorb it. The people, the language, the dialect, everything, get back into regular China. And the Chinese government, I've had very good luck with books I've written, especially the Second World War, is being translated into Chinese. And yet the Chinese Communist Party, or at least the publisher, wrote my publisher and said if I had to take those lines out or they wouldn't translate it into China and they would cancel the contract. And
wow.
Of course I couldn't do, I couldn't do that. So they canceled.
Wow,
they were very sensitive about that.
So what do you think, why they are so sensitive about it? You just mentioned Taiwan, and it's a fact, right?
Yeah, I thought they would be. It's no secret that they threaten Taiwan all the time, but they did not want to be compared to people of the past that have wiped out entire civilizations, and they didn't want to be compared to the Iranians that threaten Israel or the Turks who threaten the Armenians today. So I guess they thought that because they have such a large market and I've sold so many books there, they thought that it would be easy for me, and they wrote and said, just take out 2 lines, that's all we care about, that mention China. But of course you couldn't do that.
So you didn't do that, and so did they say anything when?
No, they just said they couldn't. I dealt with the third party through my publisher. They were talking to the Chinese counterparts, and they just said that there would be no translation into Chinese. Of course, I can't control whether they bootleg it, and they want to publish it, and then they censor it themselves. But officially and legally, they don't have the rights to publish it now because they backed out, and then they had no right to demand that under the contract, but they did, and so it's not going to appear in China.
Wow. So did that happen to you before with your other books?
No, it's very ironic because when I wrote a book called The Second World Wars, China was on our side, and it was prior to the Communist Revolution. So I was very sympathetic to the Chinese cause, and I mentioned 15 million Chinese who'd been killed by Japanese occupational troops and kind of a Holocaust. Only 2 million of them were combatants. The other 14 million were systematically starved or executed or burned alive, et cetera, and because I didn't mention any politics because it wasn't germane to that, and because at the time Mao said he was a semi-ally of the United States, and they had suspended their civil war against Chiang Kai-shek, they were happy to publish it, and it sold a lot of copies. So I guess that's why they were interested in doing it again.
But when the fact does not, and the history does not is not in their favor, they just change.
They don't. They want to write history. They don't want to read about it.
Wow.
Rewrite. Yeah. And I went back and I sent to the publisher. I had only mentioned 2 instances of a member of the People's Liberation Army who had threatened to strike Tokyo if they helped Taiwan. And I found, I think, 15 direct threats that you can find in news accounts where members of the Communist Party and the people have said that if they take Taiwan and South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, and Japan and the United States were to intervene, they would use nuclear weapons, or they would use nuclear weapons against Taiwan, or they would annihilate Taiwan, or they had the ability to erase it. And they're not shy about saying that. The same was true with Putin and some Russians about Ukraine. They say it's a bastard state, it shouldn't exist, it doesn't exist, it belongs to Russia. And they have the right, at some point, if the Western allies don't stop helping it, they're going to use nuclear weapons. I don't know if that, everybody discounts all these threats, and most of them are empty threats. But as I show in the book, sometimes they're not empty threats. And you should take them seriously, especially when the targeted state has no accurate measurement of their comparative strength. It seems that Constantinople was the largest city at one time in the Roman Empire. And yet people 1,100 years later, they had such a glorious tradition, they just didn't think anybody would ever dare attack Constantinople, and they didn't have the ability to do it. If they did, they had the largest walls in history. But it's a characteristic of some states or nations or empires in decline. They don't realistically compare their resources and the resources of their attacker, and they don't understand the nature of their attacker, and they don't understand that no one is going to come to their help. And in the case of Taiwan, if that paradigm is true, they should be arming themselves to the teeth right now, because if they think the United States and Australia and Japan and Korea are all going to risk their cities and subject them to a nuclear attack, and that's what China has threatened, if anybody helps Taiwan, the chances are that maybe some of these states would not help them. But in all of the cases that I studied, the people were on the walls waiting for help to come. They were sure that help was going to come to Constantinople from Rome. It never came. And most people are self-interested. They look at the comparative strength or the odds, and then they don't want to intervene.
真的没有想到，汉森教授的这个书啊，在中国的出版商那边，有经历到这样的一件事情。那么，汉森教授既然提到了中国共产党，那如果跟历史相比的话，汉森教授有没有看到中共跟那4次战争中啊毁灭了文明的势力有任何相似之处吗？
Well, all of these attackers were autocratic. The Spanish Empire of 1521 under Charles V was a monarchy. And the Carthaginians were attacked by the Sultan, who had absolute power. And Alexander the Great was a king. And of course, Scipio was the only one. He was actually appointed by the Senate, but because during the siege of Carthage, he was given dictatorial powers to do whatever he wanted by the agreement of the Roman Senate. And the thing about all of these attackers are they're not outwardly evil people. In other words, they're very effective propagandists. Alexander was a killer, but he was a student of Aristotle and he was a friend of philosophers, and he said he didn't want to destroy. It would be very sad if he had to destroy Thebes. And Scipio Aemilianus, at his side, was the famous historian Polybius, and he was a man of letters. He had something called the Scipionic Circle of Intellectuals. Mehmet bragged that he had the largest library in the Islamic world. Cortez was very, very learned. He had a lot of fellow intellectuals around him. And so what I'm getting at is that these are not Genghis Khan or Tamerlane or Attila the Hun that come through and just kill people. And so if you would apply that to China, you can see that Xi is he's not just someone like Saddam Hussein, or he's not someone like Gaddafi, or he's not someone like Kim Jong-un. He puts on pretensions of, when you see him, he looks very calm, measured. He doesn't say crazy things like Kim Jong-un. He kind of bites his lip like he's saddened that he has to do something. He talks in generalities, and he always talks about China is doing their best for a peaceful world. They want to be a member of the international community. They take their responsibilities very seriously in a multi-party fashion. They're a reliable member of the Security Council, all of that stuff. But if you look what he does to the Uyghurs or what he's done to internal dissidents, he's a killer. But in the West, we're very afraid to say that. Just as in antiquity, people said, well, Alexander would never destroy Thebes. He's not that type of person. So that is one of the reasons they're so vulnerable. And I think that's one of the reasons people, among many, discount the Chinese threat, besides the profit motive that, you can get rich doing business with China. But they look at China and they have touchy-feely. They don't really see it as a communist Stalinist party. And they have students here, they have mutual exchanges, they play basketball, they send their movies over here, vice versa. He's always very calm. And so people don't really understand the nature of the Chinese Communist Party.
其实来到美国这么多年我心里呢一直有一个问题，我不知道其他从共产主义中国来的朋友是不是也有这样一个问题，就是说中国共产党从1949年夺取政权以来所杀害的中国人要远远多于纳粹希特勒在20世纪30-40年代所杀害的犹太人，对不对？当然了，这些灭绝人性的行径都是很邪恶的，但是为什么美国人呢是如此的痛恨纳粹，而对于手上沾有更多血腥的更加近代的中国共产党反而没有那么大的反感和警惕呢？汉森教授是怎么看的呢？
You made some good examples about the 30s and 40s. They did think they were, of course, they did think after Pearl Harbor the Japanese were killers, and they understood Hitler after 41 and Mussolini. But you got to remember that from the early 30s, Hitler, like Xi, played a victim. In other words, he went around Europe. He said that he had no territorial ambitions. All he wanted to do was unite Germany. He went through the depression. He bragged about his Autobahns. He had the 1936 Olympics there. He said that it was a lie that he was persecuting Jews. He forbid anti-Semitic activity during the Olympics. He said that he just wanted to have the German people recover from the humiliation of World War I. And the Japanese, many of the members of the Japanese war cabinet had gone to school in the United States. All of them had visited the United States. Tojo, Admiral Yamamoto, the chief diplomat Mosaka, he had grown up in Oregon, and they were all praising the United States, and Japan kept telling us that we had been on the right side. They had helped us in World War I. Mussolini was very popular in America. Even though he was a dictator, they said, wow, he made the trains run on time in Italy. Look what Italy has done. It was a mess. And you go to Italy today, they have beautiful buildings. They've got new trains. They've got new highways. They're like the Autobahns. So he was very popular, especially among leftists, because remember that all of these people said they were not just dictators, but they were socialists. It was National Socialism in Germany. And Mussolini had been a communist, and then he went to fascism. But if you look at what fascism was in Italy, it was state-owned property, business. And so they passed themselves off as socialist nationalists. And it wasn't until we actually saw them invade other countries that people wised up. So today, when you look at China, you know, you see students with a little Mao hat with a star on it, and Bill, you know, Barack Obama's Anita Dunn, her communications director, you remember, told a high school group that Mao was her favorite hero. And I was watching some of the campus protesters the other day, and some of them had those little worker caps, the communist hats on. So there's a lot of naivete about communism in general, and it's only if China were to get into a real conflict, or people had a bird's eye view of what they did to Tibet, or what they do to Uyghurs, or what they do to dissidents, would they understand that. But it was very hard for Americans even to say that it looks like the Wuhan lab was engaging in gain-of-function research with the help of the United States and subsidies from Anthony Fauci, and that lab was under the control of the People's Liberation Army. And the idea that that virus came from a bat or pangolin was propaganda. And most of the people who knew the truth were either exiled, internally exiled, or killed mysteriously. And they were working probably on a bioweapon. They may not have released it deliberately, but if you had said that 3 years ago, you would be fired at a major university. And yet now, all of a sudden, if you read the New York Times or the Washington Post, it's just an accepted fact. Yes, it was gain of function. Yes, the Chinese were experimenting in a way that was very dangerous. Yes, they were being subsidized by stupid people in the West. Yes, they covered it up. Yes, they made a lie that it was a bat. So it's not very different.
那么从汉森教授的这个分析来看呢，我总结出来的大概是2个部分。那美国人对于中国共产党不了解，甚至有天真的看法的原因是什么呢？一方面呢，是因为学校里不教；另一方面呢，中国政府影响或者是控制国内国外的媒体机器而且是有非常丰富的宣传经验，从而呢误导迷惑了很多观众，很多的民众，包括很多美国人，是不是这样呢？
They do, and if you try to tell Americans that the Chinese are sending fentanyl directly to the cartel factories in Mexico for the express purpose of killing Americans, and about 100,000 Americans die, and it's a lie that they all overdose. What's happening is a lot of people take illicit drugs like Valium or Oxycodone, but they're disguised. That's how they sell fentanyl. Fentanyl is in them, and that sometimes kills them. And if you say to people, the Chinese know exactly what they're doing. If you say to them, there's 300,000 Chinese students here, and maybe 1%, which would be 3,000, are actively engaged in espionage for the CCP and the PLA, or people get angry at you, and they get angry, and they say that's not fair. The Confucius Institute is not a spy organization. Or where I work, they arrested a neuroscience. You remember a neuroscientist that happened was she was a colonel in the PLA, and people got angry that she was outed, not that she was a spy. And the Chinese have been very sophisticated in their propaganda. They play the victim. They say we're the victim of traditional anti-Asian racism in the United States or something like that. And if you try to tell them that they are racist and they suppress people of different ideologies and religions, no one believes you. But so we have an idealistic, I think it goes back all the way to World War II, where we were very sympathetic due to early Christian missionaries in China. We were very sympathetic to the Chinese people, especially once Japan started butchering Chinese, and they were not developed militarily to defend themselves. So we had that kind of touchy-feely, rosy view, and then the Chinese came in, the communists, and played on that. And they posed as reformers. You like Chinese people, and we're reformers. We have land reform. And it wasn't really until the 1970s that we understood that they were killing and butchering, millions of people.
What do you think? 那么其实呢 is the solution to get out of this? It sounds like the CCP is really one of those threats could repeat the history, right?
Yes. Well, one thing we know is that China tries to avoid confrontation, direct, overt, because China believes that technologically they're still dependent on the United States. All of their weaponry, their sophisticated weaponry, came from espionage or foreign transfers. And they feel that if that were to stop, within 10 years, the West, and because the West has open debate and people can write papers and they can investigate theories and cross-examine each other, at least we used to be able to, without government interference. And that means that our science is going to be more sophisticated than theirs in a closed society. Just like during World War II, Germany got rid of all their great scientists. So they don't want to break off with us because they like to steal and borrow from us. But they believe in the long view. They can gradually just build a few bases in the South China Sea, stop. Just bully Taiwan, then stop. Turn North Korea loose, have it threaten Japan, have it threaten South Korea, tell them to keep threatening, and then when somebody pushes back, stop. And then send fentanyl to Mexico, or have biolabs as we saw, or send a balloon across, and then stop right before people get angry. But the key thing to remember is each time they stop, they don't stop where they were. They stop at a more aggressive period. When they overfly Japanese airspace, they go 1 mile in, and then 2 miles, then they stop. But they don't go back to 0, they go back to 1 mile. And that's their theory. And the only way that you can stop it is to, you have to have a deterrent against them. And that would mean that the United States has to not only increase their defense budget, but spend money much more wisely. And we're short 45,000 soldiers. And if you look at the recruitment, it's not black soldiers, it's not Hispanic soldiers, it's not gay soldiers, it's not Asian soldiers, it's not female soldiers that are not joining. It's white males of the lower and middle classes. And unfortunately, these are the people who died that made up 75% of the dead in Iraq and Afghanistan, yet they only comprise 34% of the population. So in other words, the people who generation after generation volunteer in special forces, the Marine, to go off to awful places like Kandahar or Fallujah, our military called them racist. If you remember General Milley, and said he was going to look for racism and et cetera. And they didn't, they're not racist, but he alienated that whole group. And then he said, even if you've had COVID and you don't get a vaccination, you're going to be expelled. So they expelled 8,500 of them. Most of them were white males who had natural immunity. And now we're short 45,000. And you can't do that if you're in an existential war with China. You can't let a balloon go across the United States for 14 days. You have to tell the Chinese that there's consequences. But you can only do that if you have overwhelming power. So we can see that Israel's Iron Dome and Arrow anti-ballistic missile system, it works. And we created that technology. We should have a Marshall Plan right now to have a complete missile defense system over the United States. And we should be building up our nuclear and our non-nuclear forces at a rate that China would be very afraid of. We should be going to the Australians, the Japanese, the Taiwanese, the South Koreans, the Philippines, and say, we all are in this together, and we all have to have a particular level of defense spending, and we have to integrate our forces. Doesn't mean we're all going to go to war. We're not going to try to start a war, but we have to make sure that when China comes to one of you and says, as they do. You know, at the Hoover Institution, I get a lot of people that come from different countries, and they all say the same thing about China. The Chinese diplomat or member of the military will go to one of these frontline democracies and say, you know, we're much nicer to you than they are, the Americans or the Europeans, and they're in decline. And if you get in an argument with us, you're on your own. They won't come to help you. Look what they did in Afghanistan. Look at what they did to Israel. So you can't count on these people, but you can get rich with us. All you have to do is be part of our team. And that's what the message is. And we've got to give people the confidence they can resist that.
听起来呢，这个问题是涉及到了美国的国内政策、文化以及对外政策两方面的，对不对？
Yeah, it's very important. And when I looked at these civilizations of the past, they were all in financial trouble. In other words, they had been very, very wealthy and powerful, and they had a name, a great deal of prestige. Carthage at one time was more powerful than Rome. Constantinople at one time had a population of 20 million people, and it was from the Persian Gulf all the way to Spain. But they didn't realize that they were in severe decline. In our case, we're borrowing $1 trillion every 3 months, and we were 35 trillion in debt. And, you know, we're not taking advantage of our natural gas, our oil, our rare minerals for batteries. We have everything you need. We have the richest natural resources, but we're not taking advantage of them. Chinese are looking at all of this, and they're bewildered. They said, you know, if we had the United States and we had all these natural resources and all these universities and all, we would be doing this. And so we're hurting ourselves when we should be uniting against these foreign threats. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Turkey, maybe Venezuela. They all are starting to line up against us.
好，朋友们，您觉得汉森教授的分析啊，对您有启发吗？就是这本书啊，美国陆军中将、前国家安全顾问麦克马斯特将军啊，评论这本书说啊，他说在这一切的终结这本书中，汉森讲述了文明如何消亡的引人入胜而令人痛苦的事情。他帮助我们根据这段历史来思考当代事物，思考不可想象的事情，并认识到要努力防止我们自己灭亡的紧迫性。好，如果您喜欢这期节目内容的话呢，请您记得点个赞哈。在汉森教授这本书啊，《一切的终结》The End of Everything 啊，他呢还谈到了科技的发展是如何对道德的滑落产生影响的，美国应当如何来恢复道德。另外呢，美国所面临这个威胁到底到了什么样的程度？他对美国的未来呢是怎么看的？是不是乐观还是说悲观呢？另外，汉森教授还披露了一个非常惊人的亲身经历，跟中共的间谍战有关系他以前跟我提过他的一部分的这个经历，但是呢，没有想到他就是另外的这个一个层面。那么这些内容呢，我就会在下次的节目里面跟大家继续分享。所以，请您记得一定要点赞我的频道，打开小铃铛。对了，我还想分享一个消息啊，汉森教授呢，前些日子他身体非常虚弱，因为之前他已经有2次感染新冠病毒了，那一次呢，就是他觉得他可能是第3次感染，身体非常虚弱，就没有这种味觉啊，和听觉，那我就送了他2瓶这个西洋参滴管，就是这个。以前呢，跟大家好像讲过1、2次。前几天我又采访他的时候呢，他就跟我说，他说，这个挺有效的那他把这个西洋参滴管呢是怎么做的是这样的，小小的一瓶，但是它是可以滴的。他就把它呢这个滴到水里面当茶喝。然后他说，哎呀，挺有效的，因为他本来到了下午他就开始发困人虚弱嘛。但是喝了这个西洋参的茶之后，他说：“哎呀，马上就很有精神非常管用。而且呢，经常服用这个产品的话，是会提升免疫力的。这个是 加拿大的西洋参产品哈，非常高浓度的这种萃取物。所以呢，看他就是觉得很有用，我也很开心，他也很开心。那么我就想在这里啊，趁这个机会把这个好消息也跟朋友们分享一下，或许您自己或者家人呢也能够从这个产品中受益。如果有兴趣尝试一下的话呢，或者想给自己的你很关心的亲朋好友送礼的话呢，这都是一个很好的选择啊。在我的节目下面就有这个怎么可以购买这个产品的链接，是在蓝莓优品的网站上去购买。那么那在我自己的这个节目下面是有同类的这个产品，就叫黑高兹，这是一种更加浓度高的哈，但是呢可能口味呢更苦一点的这个产品。那么如果到蓝莓网站上呢，就可以找到这个滴管，然后还有更多其他的产品。那这都是蓝莓优品啊，是我们合作的长期合作的这样一个电商，他们呢都是精心挑选的很多很好的产品，包括那个眼贴啊，还有就是辛恬非常推荐的德国面膜。所以呢那您的这个选购哈，不仅说是能够帮助到您自己的，对于辛恬的频道呢也是一种非常实际的支持。好，在这里呢辛恬就谢谢朋友们的选购了和支持了。那最后呢，按照观众朋友的建议啊，我们来学习一个英文单词好不好？这样日积月累的话呢，不知不觉中啊，就可以增长我们的这个英文单词和能力了。那尤其是汉森教授啊，他真的是学识非常的渊博，在翻译他的这个采访的时候呢，我自己也每次都学到很多的新的英文单词和历史知识。我不知道大家觉得这个 idea 怎么样哈？我们先试一次吧。然后呢，务必请大家提供一个反馈，看看我们以后是不是继续可以这样做。好，今天我们学什么呢？我们来学一个词 annihilation。annihilation 灭绝、毁灭的意思哈。这个其中的 h 是不发音的 annihilation。那可以怎么用呢？比如说，全面的核子战争能导致人类的灭绝。A full-scale nuclear war could lead to the annihilation of the human race. Annihilation. 好，其实呢，我想这次在我发现就是汉森教授讲的一个英文俚语啊，我们也可以学起来。因为我在翻译这个采访的时候啊，碰到了呢，开始有点不太确定到底什么意思哈。Arm to the teeth 啊 ，arm to the teeth， 听起来是说哇，连牙齿都戴上盔甲了哈。它真正的这个实际意思呢，就是说你为了做某件事情做好非常充分的、全面的准备，那也就是我们中文里说的什么全副武装啊 ，arm to the teeth， 全副武装。比如说，您可以对你的孩子说啊，他为了考试做了充分的、全面的准备。你说 ，Wow, you were armed to the teeth for your exam， 对吧 ？Armed to the teeth。好，您觉得啊，这两个词，一个是英文单词，一个是英文俚语啊，有没有让您学到呢？或许有的朋友都已经知道了，那也是非常有可能。所以呢，就请您留言让我知道，这样的学习，这样的教单词哈，我们一起来学习方法好不好？还有呢，就是说这样的程度哈，好够不够？就是或者说还是太浅，因为说实话非常难以来衡量，因为我们观众朋友中间呢，肯定英文程度是各有不同的哈。我们就看看吧。所以呢，务必请您给我留个言好不好？觉得说好就这样来学，或者说哎呀不需要了。不管怎么您怎么想的哈，我希望大家呢越多的人留言来反馈就越有帮助。那我们就看看以后可以怎么样做好吗？好的，那就非常感谢您的收看，也谢谢您啊可以点赞和转发。那我们就下次节目再见喽，拜拜。